Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is George Saiz. He is a coach, a writer, and a speaker. He actively promotes enterprise excellence through a people-centric culture to the next generation of leaders. He's the author, recently released, of a business novel called We Started with Respect. So in that book, and we're going to talk about it today, he shares from his extensive executive experience in the medical device industry, and what he's learned from a lot of best practices sites that he visited when he was president and CEO of AME, the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, an organization I'm sure listeners and viewers know of. So George is now retired, currently resides with his wife in Carlsbad, California. So George, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
I am jealous, I'm sure, of not to get too sidetracked on this. So, California weather in July. I'm sure. I hope it's a glorious time of year, right?
It is finally nice. I have to tell you that I know the country's gone through some climate change, and it's actually been cold here the entire year since December. And so I've had to wear long pants out to golf and had golf canceled because
Oh,
of rain.
yeah,
So, but I have to say, since July came, we've finally gotten some nice 72, 73 degree days and clear skies. So it's a beautiful day at the beach.
yeah. You're probably not going to garner. I'm not a golfer, so it doesn't bother me. You're not going to garner much sympathy of having to wear long pants for the winter golf. But I spent 2 years closer to Los Angeles along the coast, and I do miss that weather, especially summertime in other parts of the country now.
Right, right. Absolutely.
Okay, but this is not the weather podcast, sorry, but we are going to talk about George's new book. Again, it's called We Started with Respect, but we start generally here on the podcast. I like to ask people their origin stories. So, everyone's got a unique story of where they first got exposed to lean or TPS or however it was being framed at the time. What's your lean origin story?
Oh, well, that's a fun one. I had just become a new general manager of a very small division that was it was in dire straits. It had been the market leader and had a dominant market share and very profitable, and it had lost a lot of that. And so as I came in, it was time to transform the entire business, and I was looking at where to start. And fortunately for me, another one of our divisions had gotten involved with lean, and they were teaching a seminar. This was within a Bristol Myers Squibb companies, and they were teaching a seminar called The Goal. And it was
Oh,
based on the book by Eli Goldratt.
mhm.
And so I was invited to come to that and take the course. And so I read the book, and it made absolutely no sense to me.
Yeah.
The lot size of one, I thought, no, doesn't make sense, doesn't fly. That doesn't, I don't know if it's going to solve anything, but I'll go down there. It was in North Carolina, and okay, I'll go down there and I'll see what they got to say, but it didn't make sense to me. And so the first half of the day was discussion and going through the book principles and everything, and it still wasn't really doing much for me. But then the second half of the day was the Lego block simulation.
Mm.
And oh my gosh, all the lights went on, and it just really then it made sense to me, obviously. And so when I left there, I asked the guy that was instructing, I said, would you give me all the materials? I'd like to take my entire company through this course. And so I went back here to California. I was leading a California-based division, and I actually then went through some training, and I took all the employees through, and I was the one that led the exercise, and we had about 12 employees each time, and we just went through our entire company, which was fun for me to get to know everybody.
Mm.
I was
Mhm.
new in the company, and we were in a turnaround situation, but it was a great experience. And it was the same thing that we all went through was, yeah. Then you do the Lego blocks, is, oh my gosh. And so it was a fantastic time for us. I will tell you just a snippet, because I know all of you guys have been through the same kinds of things. But as an example, when we started our lean implementation, we would pull a work order, release a work order, pull the parts, take it down through assembly, inspect it, package it, put it into finished goods. And the average time was about 2 to 3 weeks from start to finish, from release to put it into finished goods. And when we finished, we were doing that in 2 hours.
Wow.
And so you can imagine all the things that had to happen to get to that point. But it was just a fun time and a fun turnaround for the company as well. So after that, I was completely sold, and it's just a wonderful process.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's the one thing that stands out to me in your telling of that story is the power of a leader going first in terms of the learning of, how often does an organization get the benefit of, whether it's in the context of lean or whatever, of the general manager, CEO, business unit lead, going and getting the training and coming back and say, okay, I'm going to not just send everyone else to it, but I'm going to teach it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't seem like that happens very often. I mean, I'm applauding you for it.
Well, thank you. And I think it's a big difference maker too, because I would see so often in companies that I would tour that have implemented lean that, so often it gets relegated to operations.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader, the senior leader, the executive doesn't see it as a company-wide exercise and process. They say, well, that's something you do out there in operations. And so I think that was an advantage for me. And then when I kept growing in my career and getting larger responsibilities in bigger companies, then we were always looking at our lean implementation as enterprise-wide, always. And that's a huge advantage because it does apply throughout our business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a difference. I mean, thinking about different pathways that people could go through with lean. A lot of organizations say, okay, well, here's a list of tools that we're going to go and implement, versus coming at it from the direction of like, what business problem are we trying to solve? How are we applying lean concepts or problem solving methods to those challenges? Is it a throughput challenge, a quality challenge, a safety challenge, a cost and profitability challenge? Are there ways where you've been able to influence business leaders to look at lean from more of that perspective of business benefit as opposed to operations activity?
Well, I think when you are able to share that you can find in most aspects of your business a process. So whether you're doing accounting or you're doing sales or you're doing R&D, you still have a process. And if you can explain how we can break down and apply this to the process, then I think it opens their eyes to see that it's applicable throughout the company.
Yeah.
And certainly, we go back, and I know this kind of ties in certainly to the book, but for Toyota, at the heart of this was always respect. And I think that when we do tie in the cultural aspect, then I think leaders see the benefit and can understand. Again, I'll say that, if we treat our folks with respect, we have the chance of getting what I would call commitment. And if we don't treat them with respect, then we get maybe compliance or blind obedience, but it's a huge difference. And it's a huge difference in the operating results as well.
So I'm going to ask a question. A friend of mine, I'm not going to name names or location or industry, but a friend who may end up listening to this episode had shared with me about conversations within his organization. There was an assessment done, and there was a thing around safety, and the assessment said, well, there's a compliance-based culture, which was like kind of low in the spectrum of where it could be. And my friend, who's a long-time lean practitioner, is having to have conversations, kind of challenging people who, if I remember right, he said like they thought compliance was fine. They thought, oh, compliance, oh, good. So to somebody or an executive, how would you kind of try to explain the difference between compliance and, other words, like commitment, and like why is that a necessary progression to get beyond just compliance?
Sure. Well, I think if you just envision what that means, what the word means, compliance is I'm going to do what's required of me. And that's okay. That's good. But commitment also implies that I'm not going to do what's required of me. I'm going to take it a step further. And if I need to take that extra step if somebody needs some extra help, I don't need to just do it and walk away and say, well, that's good enough and hope it works out. I'm not going to walk away till I know it's going to work out, until I know it's good, because I care and I'm committed, to the folks that are committed to me as well. So I think, it's just, sometimes folks don't want to invest in this area that we call the relational part of business, or maybe sometimes call it the soft stuff. But really, if you look at some of the results, it's phenomenal. The operating results of companies that do focus on engagement and on commitment and on respect and trust. It's light years.
And I don't know if there's anyone that would ever claim that compliance is the path to world-class performance or manufacturing excellence. Like AME is not or Shingo Institute. They're not giving awards for like the most compliant company.
Right.
Just on the surface, it sounds kind of silly, right?
It does. Well, in terms of like a regulatory environment, are you compliant to the regulatory, we all tend to, like we say, the taxes, you don't try and do better than the IRS requires. You just do, you're compliant.
Sure.
The kind of same thing in my world, we were in the medical device. We weren't trying to get an A+ with the FDA, but we were trying to make sure we were compliant. So there might be some areas where that applies, but, in terms of performance and attitude, I'll take commitment any day over compliance.
I think it's in addition to in that spectrum or progression. That compliance is fine, but not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient, perhaps.
Yeah, you definitely want to build upon that.
So, you talked about this exposure to the Goal Ellie Goldrat's book. Was this like early to mid 90s? Just guessing of when the Goal was popular. Most popular.
1991.
1991. Yeah.
And actually, that book heavily influenced the book that I wrote. In fact, it's why I wrote this book in a novel form.
Right.
I had read business books, and I would tend to read the first 5 or 6 chapters and think, I think I got the gist of it, and then I wouldn't finish it. And this one just kept my attention because I got involved with the characters and I wanted to see what happened. And also, the novel provided me the opportunity to give it to my wife to read. And this was my first time in a leadership role as far as at a divisional level. And it was a turnaround situation. So she was able to understand a lot of the things that I was going through without just getting bombarded with a bunch of business terms. So I thought that if I ever wrote a book, I'd want to write it as a business novel, which had some complexities, but it was the influence from the Goal that started that.
Yeah, it kind of spawned a whole genre of business novels. I don't know if the Goal was the first. I think it was definitely the most popular or the first popular one in that format.
Right. Well, the Goldmine after that, I think was very good, and Patrick Lencioni's book, the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, is also written as a business fable. Yeah.
So the Goldmine, Michael Ballet, and I think Pascal Dennis has a couple of business novel format books as well. So we'll come back and talk about the book in a second. Again, we're joined George Saiz. The book is We Started with Respect. I started with weather in this conversation again. Sorry about that. But what I was going to come back to was when did you get exposed to, let's say, something framed as lean or TPS and sort of combining or layering? I assume it was more combining it with what was learned from theory of constraints instead of replacing.
Right. It was further down in my career after that. When I got to work for another company that was definitely steeped in lean and very involved. In fact, it was the group that introduced me to AME, and they had won several awards, and a lot of folks that had been steeped in it for quite some time, and that's when it kind of transferred over from the things we learned through Goldrat to more of the TPS based system and approach.
Yeah, and I haven't seen a lot of this in a while, but I can't think of how much time has been spent people debating online on LinkedIn or blog comments of lean versus theory of constraints. Like there's a lot of time invested into that. I'd rather think through, like when I was at General Motors, 1995, starting my career, they brought in, I think it was literally Gold Rat's consulting group. And we read the book, and there was kind of a cheesy video version.
I think I've seen that
dramatization of the book, and they had they were doing like a computer-based simulation. But I remember there was a lot to be learned there. And then GM was starting to be influenced by Toyota people / lean, however we were going to label that. I mean, I think there's very few parts of it that come into conflict, really. I don't think we should be debating this versus that. What are we learning from them, from each of them? What would you say if somebody were trying to start that debate, which I'm not trying to start here?
Well, I think that TPS really layered on the tools and the culture aspect on top of this, and so it in my mind it was more of a progression. Mm-hmm. So I learned more about how to do it and what tools to use to accomplish that, and so I think that was what made a difference for me.
Yeah,
and certainly in the implementations after that were quite different because we were much more tool based.
Yeah. And the thing that comes to mind now that we're kind of thinking about this, I mean, I think if I'm remembering right, for what it's worth, the theory of constraints, people would say, like, your first operation should be your bottleneck, because then you can't be building up WIP through the flow. And mm-hmm. like some TPS purists, which I'm not always sure what that phrase means, like, well, you shouldn't have a bottleneck. You should have a balanced operation. And like, the world's complicated. We'll figure things out, and we'll see if we can really be a purist. I don't know what that gets us. So we can learn something from all these methodologies, I think.
Right. Well, for me, it started with Herbie and then just kept going from there.
Mm-hmm. So the book, we started with respect. Is that born directly from one of the lean transformations that you were a part of, where it did, like, literally? Am I taking the title too literally, or what was the inspiration for the title?
Well, the inspiration, I think, really was the focus on culture and that in people, mm-hmm. and that I just am a big proponent that if you start there, it should start with respect. And one thing that I was noticing when I was at AME and getting to go see all these companies in the last several years, if you remember back, if you take back 15 years ago, and folks were starting their lean implementation, the first thing they were starting with was either 5S, or they were starting with they set up a cell, middle manufacturing, and try and get some kind of a success story going and building. But even though they did that, a lot of times, folks are resistant to change. And so, that would be localized to a success there, but there'd be a lot of battlegrounds going on about, well, we're not going to change. They're not going to force me to do that. And so I just felt like that the culture is that starting point. It's not and I'm seeing that companies in AME that I was touring, getting back to that they were starting with the focus on culture for a couple of years before they would go into their lean implementation. And so instead of starting with the tools and starting with that resistance to change, they're starting with culture, and they're building, starting with respect, they're building trust, and then they're talking about the tools. And the folks, then they trust management, they trust each other. Mm-hmm. And those tools then can go in much, there's a lot less resistance to change at that point. Right. So sorry for my little brain spasm there, but it was, I just saw that really changing, and I thought that is what made sense to me. And if I could go back and change how we did things at some of the implementations I was involved in, we would have started with that to begin with. Yeah. And so that's ended up being why the book was that way, because I thought that was the most important thing at this point to start with. I think that you will get a much deeper and much more sustainable lean implementation if you start with that first.
Yeah, and a lot of times people will frame things as an or. So again, like lean or theory of constraints. I'm like, well, why not and? Thing about the focus on process, within, the lean mindset and methodology, that doesn't mean it's process or people, that we can, or it's on, need to focus on both, right?
Right. I mean, it's people are the ones who are doing it, and our culture is how we get that done. Our processes are how we deliver the product, and so they're all equally important.
Yeah.
In fact, there's four things that I'd like to look at as a senior leader when I go to a company, and that is begin with the people, and then the culture, because I believe the people are the ones who are going to do the job, and the culture is how they do it. Then the product portfolio, because that's what we're going to deliver to our customer, and then the operating systems, and those are how we deliver it to our customer. And so they're all integrated together. My belief is you can have great products and a great system, but if you don't have the right people and the right culture, you're not going to be able to deliver it. And so I like to start first with that people, but you need all four ultimately to be successful.
Yeah. And, you bring up trust. Like, I mean, without trust, Toyota uses language around mutual trust. Like, without mutual trust, I don't know what else you can really accomplish. Because when you think through, scenarios where aspects of lean or the Toyota production system only work because of trust. Like, for example, I think of somebody reaching up and pulling an andon cord. It's not going to happen without mutual trust of management trusting the employees aren't going to just pull the cord because they don't want to work, and that employees trust that their leaders aren't going to come and yell at them or blame them or punish them. Like, where are some other elements of, like, what just wouldn't work in the context of lean without a high enough level of trust?
Well, I think what you're mentioning there, that's a very good point. That the folks, when we talk about respect, I think that the one thing that I've always advocated is that if we talk about respect in the business, we tend to think about respect from management to employees. And that's very, very important. But I think that when you're developing your culture, it's got to be a culture of respect from management to employees, from employees to management, and from employee to employee. And you have to have that entire circle, because you're ultimately dependent on each other as a team. And as you said, that trust, when you're going to pull that cord, when you stop that process, that management is going to say that's a good thing to do, and there's recognition. I remember going to a tour of a company that they had a recognition board, and they had up there posted all of their failures. And so I thought that was really interesting that they were that open to say, we're going to congratulate and reward this person because they found a failure, and they found it here. And the importance that they emphasized was, you found it here, and it wasn't our customer finding it out there. And they celebrated, all the times when they found a mistake, they celebrated those. And that's a heck of a, trust there that's been developed. And respect between each other.
And I think I'm remembering the late Norman Bodek talking about some companies that would do that same thing. I think this might have been, from one of his Japan visits, but, in the context of doing my podcast, My Favorite Mistake, I've had some guests talk about celebrating mistakes or failures, within an American company. Jim McCann, who was the founder of 1-800-Flowers, very different type of business. He described how, they would kind of do a celebration and, like, mistake of the month, awards even. And like, that doesn't, like, to me, that doesn't encourage more mistakes. We're not, somehow incentivizing it. We're just recognizing the reality of mistakes are happening, and to celebrate the fact that somebody felt safe to call it out.
Right.
I think helps us improve.
That could tie back into our discussion on committed versus compliant. The compliant person says, oh, well, not my job. I did what I was supposed to do. I was compliant, check the box. But the committed person says, I don't think that looks right. I think there's a potentially a problem there. Can we check this out before it gets to the customer? And they care enough about the company to do that. And they feel safe to do it, obviously.
So, and one other thing I was going to ask you, George, on your website, you cite something that gets brought up a lot, the Gallup Employee Engagement Surveys, or we could almost start calling it the disengagement survey.
Right.
Long-standing problem. It's not just a COVID era thing of, 2 out of 3 employees being disengaged or highly disengaged. Kind of talk through this maybe from a problem standpoint. Like, first off, like, why do you think that exists? So I want to maybe talk about countermeasures, but like, what to you, from what your observations and experience, like what are the causes, if not root causes?
Right. Well, and I do use a lot of that information in my book. And in fact, I'm doing a keynote presentation and citing a lot of that information. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is the leadership approach. Because it's our job as leaders to provide a culture that is both engaging and motivating to our employees. And so, I don't look to the employees and say, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you engaged?"
Right.
It's, what have we not done to create a culture that engages and motivates you?
Yeah.
And for that, in fact, I like to look back and then say, well, then how do folks get into leadership? When we think about our leadership model, typically, if there's an opening, it's usually the person that's been, a functional leader. They've been good at their functional role. So the person that sells the most becomes a sales manager. The person that produces the fastest becomes the lead or the production manager. We're hoping they'll replicate that. But just because they've done that, and I'm not meaning to say to belittle this people, but were they a leader to begin with, or have they been trained to lead? And we tend to just place them into this leadership role and then hope for the best. And so we've got this whole group of leaders out there in a company, and what percentage of the folks are leaders, but they're influencing all these folks. And as I say, I, as the CEO, I can go up and stand in front of employees and say, I'm going to advocate for a people-centric leadership approach here in our company. But for you and for every employee, the culture of the company is just what your leader and what the approach they're using. And so if I say people-centric leadership, but your leader is a tyrant, the company culture to you is tyrannical then. Right. And so I think that's the gap, is that we're looking at this and saying, well, there's the results of the survey. Yeah, they're not good. And I think leaders tend to respond in a more business-centric from perspective, and they say, okay, I see those Gallup results. I must be leaking productivity like crazy because of that.
Yeah.
And so the first thing they do is develop some countermeasures to address that. They say we're going after engagement, but they're really after productivity. But I would say that if the people-centric leader would say, well, what can I do to motivate that person to engage? I like to use the word fulfillment, because I think fulfillment is a great trade for engagement. And if we can find a way to fulfill our employees each day, then they naturally become engaged. And guess what? Then all those production numbers, the engagement numbers. But by the way, there's a whole slew of statistics that Gallup also publishes that shows they compared the top quartile companies from their Q12 survey in employee engagement to the bottom quartile. And there's a whole slew of statistics of how much better it is that they're the operating results when you're in the top quartile. And it ends, that productivity is in there as well, and safety, but it ends with 23% more profitability.
Yeah.
So when we invest and find a way to engage and motivate our employees, we're actually going to improve our business statistics as well. Yeah. By leaps and bounds. And so, long-winded answer, I think it goes back to leadership and the culture that we establish and how we're able to engage our employees.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a podcast. Long-winded answers are okay.
Okay, good.
We have time. It's all right. Brain cramps are okay too. It happens.
Okay,
good. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things you touched on there. Other causes or contributing factors of, like, and this happens a lot in healthcare, taking the best individual contributor, rewarding them by saying you're now a manager, and then not really giving them standards or training or expectations of, like, oh, you'll figure it out. Like, well, some people do, but then some people end up kind of following the pattern of whatever tyrannical leader they happen to be working for, and it's unfair. It's again not the path to world-class performance. But you've
Well,
probably seen companies that are willing to make that investment in supervisors, managers, training. What have you seen that's sort of like, the best of that?
well, I'm trying to think of the company's name that does the airbags in up in Utah.
Auto.
Uh, Autolead, yes.
Yeah.
What a fabulous tour. I've been there a couple of times, and clearly that the amount of investment they make in their managers, leaders. In fact, I remember the first tour that I went through, and it was a lead telling us about a section, and I thought, my gosh, this person has got stronger leadership principles than any manager I've ever met, and they're a lead.
Mhm.
And it was phenomenal what they had done at that company, and so I think that was always for me where the bar was set in terms of investing in leadership. And I think that one of the elements that I have in the book is every leader buys in. So it's basically 100% leadership buy-in. And some people see that as maybe as an ultimatum, but I think about us in Lean, and we have standard work in production, right? I mean, and would we in production say, well, it's okay. This is how we'd like you to produce this product, and here's a picture of it, but you don't have to follow it. You can do it any way you want. I mean,
You'll figure it out.
yeah, yeah. Here's what you do in the end. Whatever you have to do to make it that. Well, we don't do that, but yet when it comes to leadership, one of the most important roles in our company, we just kind of leave it up to chance.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's a big gap in our systems, and conversely, it's a huge opportunity. And certainly we'd see that with the kind of numbers that they were sharing with us at Autoleave. The investment was paying off hugely.
Yeah. Yeah. No, impressive results, especially on important things like safety and, doing some work that's inherently risky or dangerous if they didn't have good process and good training for everybody involved.
Yeah, we talk about rocket science, and literally they're developing an airbag, something that's a controlled explosion.
Right.
So yeah, safety is a big thing there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you think of the things you take for granted and, quality and excellence. I used to use this example of like, when you're driving down the road, you don't have to even think of whether if I were to get into a bad front end collision, would the airbag go off?
Mhm.
Very, very likely to happen. And you also don't have to worry about it just randomly going off. Now, one of their competitors, Takata, then got into a bunch of trouble with that. And I stopped using that example, but I think it still applies with auto.
Right, right. Yeah.
And then, medical devices, I think another area where, you sort of take for granted, high reliability, high performance in a way that healthcare delivery, hospital care, and, you couldn't or you shouldn't make that same assumption of high reliability, unfortunately, in other settings. So I'm sorry, I got up on a soapbox there, but
well, it's so true. And having come out of medical device, arena, certainly committed versus compliant was very important, because we like to say to our employees, what if this product was being used on your spouse, your child, your mother, and make everyone like it's going to be used there, because it's going to be used on somebody's mother, somebody's father, somebody's child.
Yeah, yeah. So around culture again, that's we've been talking about it here. One of the themes, with the book, creating an extraordinary culture. One thing I wanted to talk about here, a little bit more depth, was being intentional or focusing on creating or designing or whatever word you might use, of like actively focusing on culture. Why is that so important? Why is that better than the alternative?
Right. Well, for me, actually, the word intentional that's used is the word, a big word for me, and I was always a proponent of people-centric leadership. I was involved in that, but then I went to a leadership summit, and it was put on by AME, but it was hosted by Bob Chapman, the CEO of Barry Waymiller.
Uh-huh.
And at this meeting, he used the word intentional, and he used it in terms of having an intentional plan for your culture. And I thought about that. I thought about, as president of this medical device company that I was at then, that we believed in all these things and advocated, and certainly we had a set of values that we had spent a lot of time crafting. and they were up on our website and up on the wall somewheres. But did we really have an intentional plan for taking those values and integrating them into the business and into the way that we interacted with each other? And the answer was no. And so that really got me thinking a lot about, at that time, of how do we make this really an intentional way we do business. And I'll tell you that when I wrote my book, I had a big aha moment related to this. I sent the book out to 3 different groups of beta readers, 8 people each time. And so then I started getting this feedback. And so it was very interesting. So I had a guy that I worked with in the 1980s say, "Wow, George, you wrote all about us." Yeah, there were some things in there about us, but and then another person that I worked with in the 1990s at a different company said, "Wow, you wrote all about us." Yeah, sort of, but then somebody that I worked with in the 2000s, and he said the same thing. And even a gentleman by the name of Dick Ryan, who worked at Wire Mold, said, "I read your book, and he said, I thought you told the Wire Mold story from start to finish, just say for a little bit longer." And what really hit me was that, from what Bob said, that the real issue is, we've been evolving in our approach to culture and leadership. So if we go back to World War II, post World War II was very much a business-centric culture, and the leadership approach was command and control, based on our military success. And then, we get into the 1980s, and it was much more team-based with quality circles and self-directed work teams. And then we go to the 2000s, the turn of the century, and we start talking about servant leadership, and then people-centric leadership, where everybody feels valued. And I think that the companies that participated in that evolving approach to culture were the ones that saw those changes. But the real issue was that most companies, like the companies that I worked with and the people that were responding, was they didn't have an intentional plan. They had a culture by default. And so what they had was what we talked about before: somebody getting promoted into a leadership role, and they're doing either something they read or the person that they work for, or whatever. But it's different depending on which door you open. You open a door and it's a whole different culture in each room, and that's what your company's made up of. And so there's no intentional plan, no standard work. Employees are left to say, "I don't know if those guys get raises differently, or there's a different disciplinary plan or different promotion plan, and I don't know." And then you go back into regressing into, "I'm just going to be compliant because I don't know what's going on here. It's all confusing." And so, yes, the whole idea of an intentional plan is having, just like we have strategy deployment to help us achieve our mission and vision. I think we need an intentional plan of our culture to help us integrate the values, because we all do have that set of values up there on the wall, but how do we get them into our business? How do we get them into the way that we do everything and interact with each other on a daily basis?
Yeah. I love the way you talk about that, and some of that phrase, culture by default, or, I'm thinking of somebody I've learned a lot from the last couple of years, Tim Clark, the author of a book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, which is about culture and leadership. And he emphasizes, you have a culture, right? So instead of letting it be a culture by default or just evolving or happening, he uses the phrase similar to what you're saying, culture by design. And that's the name of his podcast. So recommend, anyone listening to this, check out Tim Clark's podcast, Culture by Design. Great way to learn about leadership, psychological safety, and what that leads to: improvement and innovation, better business results. It's all connected to trust and things that we've been talking about here today.
Right. Well, we believe in that for our processes. We believe in standard work. Why wouldn't we do the same thing with our leadership approach? And it's not an ultimatum. It's being consistent and using best practices throughout the company.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, there's 2 other, I think, key pillars, it seems, from your book, and I think they're kind of interrelated. So, beyond creating an extraordinary culture, the other 2 being tearing down the walls and connecting the dots. If you would, George, give us kind of a summary of what you mean by those phrases, and hopefully I'm not wrong in that they seem interconnected.
Yeah, well, I think they are too, and certainly tearing down the walls. When we do have this culture by default, And as I said, when you go into you turn to the key and go into each door, the culture is different, and we tend to not have them, companies or departments working with each other. We have the old over the wall mentality, and so we've got to tear down those walls, and it starts. To me, it starts in the senior leadership, the executive leadership team. Too often I think that leaders, I talk about this a little bit in terms of teamwork, but leaders come into a meeting, and my question: do they come in as part of that leadership team, or do they come in as a representative of their function? Are they trying to protect their territory and their turf? And all that does is erect walls between departments. And I think that when a leader comes into a meeting, they should be aligned to the team that's highest in that room. And in fact, the senior leadership team, that the HR person should be bringing in the toolkit of the HR, but they should be part of that leadership team that's making decisions and are accountable. And it starts there as far as tearing down the walls, because if the walls are up there, believe me, the walls are throughout the organization, and everyone's doing duck and hide, and they're not going to help each other. So I think that first step is you've got to tear down the walls that are between the departments and make sure that that's all open and working together. And then connecting the dots is just what we've been talking about. Then just you tear down the walls, you've got to put something in its place, and it's reconnecting that, and that's connecting with each other throughout the company. I advocate in the book, talked about one of the things that the teamwork team did was ask each department to have a meeting with one of their suppliers within the company, one of the supplying departments, and with one of their customers. So if they were receiving parts or information from one department, to meet with them, and then conversely to meet with the person that they process is next in their step. But by sitting down and understanding what each other are trying to accomplish, and you realize that the other department isn't the enemy. I've led that off in many times that I've gone to and started. My first thing I asked is, who's the enemy? The enemy isn't the person that's working next to you, isn't the other departments. And so when we understand that, and understand that they're trying to do a job, and break that down, and how can we make that better, then you open up those lines of communication, and it's really powerful.
Yeah.
And then begin to connect those dots.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't ever want to hear the production department think the quality department is their enemy. I've worked in some environments like that. Again, that's not the foundation for world-class performance. When that exists, or sadly, in healthcare, if people view the patient safety department as the enemy, like we should all be working for the same goal. Back to what your point of, well, what if that was your grandmother on the operating room table? But it's just, I think, a lot of it flows downhill to your point of if the executive team is not really a team, and there's infighting and posturing and blaming, of course that's going to cascade through the organization.
Absolutely. I've worked in the company just like that, and in fact, I think so many times that our leadership role models could be people that have shown us great things to do, and some that have shown us what not to do, and that was something that I did see in one company. Is, oh my gosh, there was the vice presidents were set up against each other, and so there was a lot of infighting in the company, and so yeah, absolutely, it's a big part. Starts there.
Yeah. It starts with respect. It starts with teamwork. There's that, but the title of the book is "We Started with Respect," which is a great place to start. And I'm glad you're emphasizing that. Our guest again today, George Saiz. The book is available now, paperback format, hardcover format, Kindle book format, and it's available for order now. So go and check that out. I'll link to George's website in the show notes as well. So I'm going to ask one other question before we wrap up, George. I asked about your lean origin story, but I also like to ask, at any point along the way, are there any kind of key influences or mentors that really, helped your learning, your growth in your understanding and practice of lean? Anyone that, as we've been kind of jogging your memory about some of these different companies and places you've been, is there anyone that, is kind of worth kind of calling out as being influential?
Well, there's I've been fortunate to have mentors throughout my career. starting very early on when I got into my first role in any kind of a leadership role, and it was somebody that believed in me, that I was pleasantly surprised by that, and gave me an opportunity. But one mentor that I had, and this relates to lean because it relates to teamwork, but he advocates something that was very, very, very corny, a corny statement, and but I've kept it with me throughout my career. And he said that with teamwork, well, let's just start with that. Without teamwork, 2 + 2 = 3. Because we're working against each other.
Yeah.
And he said, with teamwork, 2 + 2 can equal 5. And it sounds corny, but it's something that I have found that worked. That first company that I took over as general manager, we had what we called our operating statement, and it was teamwork, quality, and speed. Our future depends on it. And it was that simple, but I really believed in that teamwork, and it's amazing how simple it is, maybe how corny that statement is, but how true it is, and it's powerful. I mean, it's just powerful the way you can move mountains together as a team, and it's certainly a lot more fun. But that mentor shared that with me, and it's stuck with me, for all these years.
Yeah. And we can all be grateful. Hopefully we have mentors who, like you were saying a minute ago, who helped show us what to do, not just the war stories and the wounds of that come from seeing what not to do. Hopefully we have both.
Right. Well, I tried to pattern some of the characters after some of the folks that I was lucky enough to work with throughout my career.
Yeah. So again, the book is We Started with Respect. I've got to ask though, the business novel format, the goal kind of set the standard of where the plant manager, there's also kind of like trouble at home and tension with his wife. And is that par for the course, that there's kind of, a subplot about the protagonist lead character's family and other struggles, or is this mostly a business novel about business?
Well, it's mostly about business. I thought about going that way a little bit. I remembered Alex Rogo and what he went through, but it was too much, to try and weave that in. It was enough to write these characters. Originally, though, I'll tell you, I wanted to write the book through the eyes of 3 characters, and what it was meant to be was jobs that I had in my career. So I did write it through the eyes of a distribution associate, a role I'd had, my first role in medical device, as a supply chain manager, and then as a CEO. And originally, I really wanted to follow these 3 characters in depth of what they were going through this transformation. But I realized that as I started trying to do it, it was going to get so big. It was going to be like a Tom Clancy novel that nobody would read. And so I do include those 3 characters in there, but I'll say it's probably 85-90% through the CEO's eyes, and then we still do capture some of the things that happen with these other 2 characters in the novel. But we pretty much, I do bring in some of their outside life, but pretty much keep it contained to business. But there is there's some different characters in there's always the character that you wonder, are they going to make it or not? And so there's one of those. There's also, I didn't say anything this before, but there's also a character that has a unique quality about him. Oh shoot, I said him. That wasn't that. I just narrowed it down. But it has a very unique quality in the way that he speaks. And so one of my questions for all my beta readers is if they could figure out what was his unique qualities. And I will tell you that all 24 readers failed. No one was able to figure out his unique quality. So if somebody can figure that out when they read the book and post it on a review, that'll be fun to see. I'll certainly respond if I can see it and say, you got it, because no one has figured it out yet. It's a very subtle but definite part of this character.
All right, cool. Again, we've been joined today by George Saiz. The book is We Started with Respect, available now. Congratulations! It's a first book. It's an accomplishment, a milestone. Hope you have opportunity to celebrate that.
Oh, absolutely! Thank you. It's been a real fun fun journey.
Yeah. You mean with the book or today on the podcast? Hopefully both.
Both.
Okay.
I always enjoy talking the things we've been talking about. This is fun.
Yeah. It has been. So I just wanted to double check. Dangerous question. I'm not a lawyer. They say don't ask a question you don't know the answer to.
Right.
That's not how a podcast works. But
yeah.
Thank you for rolling with it, George. You've been a great guest, and hope people will go check out the book. Really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it too. Bye-bye.